Building muscle mass and gaining strength are two related goals. For this reason, strength gains are often used as an indicator that muscle is being built. But are strength gains a good marker of muscle growth, and is getting stronger necessary to build muscle? To answer these questions, we first need to distinguish the differences between strength and hypertrophy. When looking at strength, there are a few ways we can look at it. Relevant to this discussion are maximal strength and repetition strength. First, let's look at maximal strength. This is probably the most straightforward way to assess strength. It simply refers to the maximal amount of load that can be lifted. For maximal strength, this is compared as a 1 rep max, or the most amount of load that can be lifted for a single rep. In addition to maximal strength, we also have repetition strength. This is a slightly more vague term because there are a few ways in which repetition strength can be assessed over time. In the most literal sense, repetition strength refers to the ability to lift more load for the same number of reps. However, improvements in rep strength may also be defined as the ability to perform the same load for more reps. Furthermore, it could also be described as the ability to perform more total reps with the same load, or more total load for the same reps across multiple sets. This is what we would usually describe as volume load or tonnage. And the assessment of repetition strength could also be taken even further by performing more total volume load within the same amount of time, or the same volume load in less time. Whether you are assessing maximal or repetition strength, there are also a few caveats to mention regarding strength assessment over time. It only makes sense to compare strength within the same constraints. This means that strength can only be compared between the same exercises and using the same technique. For example, it only makes sense to compare squat strength when performed to the same depth. While strength is a performance outcome, hypertrophy is not the same thing. Hypertrophy refers to an increase in the size of a muscle. This primarily occurs via what is known as myofibrillar hypertrophy. This is an increase in the number of myofibrils, which are just small units of contractile tissue within each muscle fiber. This increases the diameter of each muscle fiber, resulting in a larger overall muscle belly. There are also some other adaptations that have been thought to contribute to muscle growth to some extent. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and hyperplasia might also occur to some degree, although it isn't well understood to what extent this actually occurs in human muscles as a result of resistance training, but this is a topic for another discussion. Now that we understand the differences between strength and hypertrophy, let's explore how these two adaptations are related to each other. To understand this relationship, let's break down what adaptations contribute to strength gains. Essentially, there are two primary ways in which we can get stronger: by improving efficiency and by increasing muscle mass of the prime movers. First, let's look at efficiency. This refers to how much load we can lift with the muscle mass we currently have. There are two primary ways that efficiency can be improved. First is via lifting technique. This can be manipulated to make an exercise more or less efficient. In other words, our muscles are required to work more or less to move the same load. And obviously, to maximize strength, we want to use the most efficient technique possible. This ultimately comes down to the mechanics of the lift. Technical efficiency can be influenced by factors such as the bar path of the lift, the use of the stretch shortening cycle, and by manipulating joint angles to influence leverages. And the other way in which efficiency can be improved is via neural adaptations. This refers to the ability of the nervous system to maximize force production of the working muscles. There are a few neural adaptations which can contribute to efficiency, such as increasing the recruitment of muscle fibers involved in the lift, improving the timing and synchronization of contractions of multiple muscle groups simultaneously, and inhibiting activation of opposing muscles to minimize resistance. And the other primary way in which we can gain strength is via muscle growth. Simply put, if we can increase the size of the prime movers of a lift, we have more total contractile tissue that can contribute to force production. And if we can become efficient with this muscle mass, we should be able to produce higher forces and ultimately be stronger. So in theory, with all other factors equated, a bigger muscle will be stronger. To demonstrate these ideas, let's look at this study, which explored the strength and hypertrophy gains in a large sample of untrained subjects. 287 untrained men and women between the ages of 22 to 77 years performed a full-body resistance training program 2 times per week for 20 to 24 weeks. Overall, subjects saw around a 5% increase in quadriceps cross-sectional area on average, and around a 22% gain in their leg press 1RM. So while muscle and strength both increased, it wasn't a one-to-one direct relationship, since a far greater proportion of strength was gained. This is probably because this was an untrained population, meaning the primary contributor to strength gains was probably due to efficiency, as opposed to purely muscle growth. However, we see different results when looking at highly trained lifters, such in this study. 20 elite male powerlifters had ultrasounds measured at 9 sites of their body to estimate body composition. This was then compared to their best squat, bench press, and deadlift performances. It was found that there was a very strong relationship between muscle and strength performance for all 3 lifts. This is likely because at the elite level, these trainees are already highly efficient, so gains in muscle mass are probably going to be the main driver of long-term strength gains. So I think what we can say is that muscle growth increases strength potential. Growing a bigger muscle won't always have a direct proportionate increase in strength, but it will increase our long-term capacity to be strong. Although if we never train to be efficient, we aren't going to maximize our strength. Training for efficiency is an additional consideration if you are training for strength performance, but not as relevant if you are training purely for muscle growth. As we mentioned, with all factors equated, a bigger muscle is stronger. The issue though is that not all factors are equated all the time. There are many other variables that can influence our lifting performance from session to session, and that may influence long-term strength gains. And when training specifically for hypertrophy, some of these variables are likely to mask strength gains. Let's now cover what they are. The first variable that will influence strength is technique. There are 3 primary technique components that may differ depending on whether we are training for strength versus hypertrophy. The first is the biomechanical efficiency of how we lift. The goal for strength is to lift the most amount of weight possible, so it makes sense to use the most efficient technique to do so. However, the goal of hypertrophy training is to stress a specific muscle group. So in most cases, we are trying to essentially do the opposite, make the lift as mechanically disadvantageous for the target muscle as possible. So using a more efficient technique will allow us to use a heavier load, but we might not be maximally stressing any specific muscle group. Whereas less efficient lifting mechanics will allow us to maximize muscle stress, but it will come at the sacrifice of lifting less weight. For example, bench pressing with a bigger spine arch, wider grip, and using leg drive will usually be the most efficient way to lift the most amount of weight, but it might not be quite as effective for a chest hypertrophy stimulus. Whereas a flat back, feet up, moderate width grip bench press will usually provide greater pec muscle stress despite being required to use a lighter load. The next variable influencing lifting performance is our tempo and the use of the stretch shortening cycle. For strength, we want to use the tempo that allows the most load to be lifted. This will usually be a somewhat controlled but not too slow eccentric, a rapid transition to take advantage of the stretch shortening cycle, and lifting concentrically as fast as possible. Whereas hypertrophy is generally best achieved with slower eccentric tempos and minimizing involvement of the stretch shortening cycle. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of different eccentric tempos on muscle growth. 10 untrained males and females performed 5 sets of single leg extensions with 75% 1RM to failure 2 times per week for 8 weeks. One leg performed 2-second eccentrics, while the other leg performed 4-second eccentrics, with concentric tempo being 1 second in both groups. It was found that the faster 2-second eccentrics allowed lifters to complete a slightly greater number of total reps throughout the study compared with the slower 4-second eccentric tempo. However, muscle growth of the quadriceps was slightly superior in the slower tempo compared with the faster tempo. The next technique variable influencing lifting performance is range of motion. In general, training through a larger range of motion will usually require lighter loads compared with partial range of motion training. However, training through a larger range of motion, or at least training the muscle at a longer length, will generally result in superior muscle growth compared with partials. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of squat training with full versus partial range of motion. 17 untrained men performed either deep squats to around 140 degrees knee flexion, or shallow squats to around 90 degrees knee flexion. Both groups performed 3 sets of 8 reps with progressively increasing loads 2 times per week for 10 weeks. On average, the deep squat group used lighter loads, shown in the blue, compared with the shallow squats, shown in the orange, as expected. However, the deep squats resulted in superior growth of the adductors, glute max, and quadriceps compared with the shallow squats. And the last technique variable that will influence lifting performance is how strict we are with technique and how much momentum we use. In most cases, strict technique will generally limit how much load we can use compared with using more momentum. For example, we can usually lift more weight during curls if we swing the weight up compared with keeping technique very strict. While we don't have any direct evidence on how strictness influences muscle growth, it is commonly accepted that fairly strict technique is generally preferable for muscle growth. This is to ensure the target muscle is the tissue which is doing the majority of the work, not the other muscles which we aren't trying to train. Although it should be noted that in some cases, a little momentum can potentially be helpful to achieve a better hypertrophic stimulus. For example, using a little momentum during barbell rows can help even out the drastic strength curve of the exercise. But in any case, the goal isn't to use momentum simply to lift more load, it is to help provide a superior hypertrophic stimulus. Moving on to the next variable which can influence lifting performance, we have rest periods. Longer rest periods allow a greater retention of lifting performance on subsequent sets, while shorter rest periods cause performance to drop on the next set to a greater extent. And although the evidence shows somewhat mixed findings, it seems that on average, longer rest periods tend to result in slightly superior growth compared with shorter rest periods. This was established in this systematic review, which aimed to compare the effects of short versus long rest periods. The review compared the overall effects of interventions implementing short rest periods, defined as 1 minute or less, versus long rest periods, defined as anything greater than 1 minute. And overall, interventions using short rest periods tended to produce around a 6% muscle growth on average, while longer rest periods produced around 9% on average. So while longer rest periods do seem to be favourable for hypertrophy, we might opt to limit rest periods to some extent in order to make training sessions more time efficient. In some cases, it makes sense to shorten rest periods slightly to accumulate a greater total number of sets within the workout and throughout the entire week. The next variable that will influence lifting performance are the rep ranges and load used. This will firstly influence acute lifting performance within a session. Quite clearly, if we lift with lower rep ranges, we can lift heavier loads, whereas higher rep ranges require lighter loads. Also, lifting with heavier loads generally results in superior strength gains over time. This is probably due to improvements in neural and technical efficiency as a result of practicing lifting with loads that are more specific to a 1RM lift. However, the effects on hypertrophy aren't the same. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of heavy, moderate, and light load training on strength and hypertrophy. The researchers grouped interventions into light loads defined as anything greater than a 15 RM, moderate loads defined as 9 to 15 RM loads, and heavy loads defined as an 8 RM or less. As expected, heavier loads were superior for strength gains. Heavy loads were more effective than light loads, moderate loads were more effective than light loads, and heavy loads were more effective than moderate loads. But when it came to hypertrophy, no specific rep range was found to be superior. They all resulted in similar muscle growth. So if we train with lower rep ranges, we are likely to see superior strength gains over time compared with training with higher rep ranges, at least in the short term. Although this doesn't necessarily mean that muscle growth is better or worse, it is likely to be similar when training across a variety of different rep ranges and loads, provided we are taking each set close to failure. And the last factor that can influence lifting performance is body fat. Gaining or losing body fat will often improve or reduce lifting performance even without changes in muscle mass. This is because body fat can change a few different factors of a lift, although this is likely to have different effects based on each individual exercise. For example, gaining body fat will usually improve performance during a bench press. This may be because there is more tissue between the elbow and shoulder joints, which provides slightly more elastic recoil during pressing. Also, since we have more body fat on the chest, this will probably reduce range of motion slightly. In opposition, gaining body fat can often cause decreases in performance for bodyweight exercises like pull-ups. This is because there is simply more load lifted each rep since body weight is greater. Although something like a bicep curl probably won't be influenced by body fat to any significant extent. So while in the short term, many of these variables can influence lifting performance, long-term strength gains may be necessary as a form of progressive overload. Over the course of a lifting career, increases in load will usually be required to continue making hypertrophy training maximally effective. While hypertrophy appears to be similarly effective across a variety of different loads and rep ranges, going too high in reps appears to be less effective. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of training with different loads on hypertrophy. 30 untrained men performed 3 sets of single limb bicep curls and leg press with 20% 1RM to failure 2 times per week for 12 weeks. The other limbs performed the same exercises with either 40, 60 or 80% 1RM and performed multiple sets to failure until they matched the same volume load as the other limb. It was found that the biceps and quadriceps saw similar growth when training with loads of 40 to 80% 1RM, but saw inferior growth with 20% 1RM, shown in the blue. So in practical terms, it seems that it is certainly possible to train too light to maximize muscle growth. Going above around 30 reps will likely produce less growth. So lifters will likely need to increase loads eventually to make sure they are still training in the effective hypertrophy rep ranges. As a more practical hypertrophy range guideline, lifters probably want to stay within the approximate 5 to 20 rep range and adjust load over time to suit this. Furthermore, increasing rep performance on a more short-term basis may be necessary to accommodate training with a close proximity to failure. This meta-regression aimed to establish the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth. Overall, there appears to be a somewhat exponential effect of proximity to failure on muscle growth. So to maximize muscle growth, we probably want to take each set fairly close to failure, at least around 3 reps in reserve. So as we build muscle mass over time, we can probably perform more reps before reaching the same proximity to failure target. So before we increase load to the next increment up, we can just perform more reps to reach the same proximity to failure, as long as we are staying within the effective hypertrophy rep ranges we mentioned earlier. Taking all this information into consideration, let's establish some practical recommendations. Strength and hypertrophy are 2 different adaptations, but are somewhat related. Strength gains are a result of both gains in muscle mass of the prime movers, but also due to improvements in efficiency. So muscle growth can be seen as improving strength potential, but doesn't always result in a direct increase in strength. Furthermore, there are many different variables which can influence lifting performance from a short-term perspective and long-term strength gains. These include the technique we lift with, rest periods, rep ranges and load used, and our current body fat. And many of these variables can be adjusted to suit more strength or hypertrophy related goals. If your goal is to maximize muscle growth, you would want to adjust your training program for the best hypertrophy outcomes. But it should be noted that this probably won't allow you to lift the most amount of load in a workout or produce the best long-term strength gains. Although increases in load or rep performance are generally necessary over the course of a lifting career to accommodate effective hypertrophy training. However, we don't want to sacrifice other variables just for the sake of improving lifting performance. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.